So, Dr. Joshua Guitar from Kean University, so I did not have to travel far to be here. I appreciate all those who did, though. It's good to see. So, my project that I'll be talking about today is it's called Abstructing Chelsea Manning. It builds from a book that I published in 2021. I have flyers here for those of you who might be interested in what I have to say today. The discount that's on the flyer is no longer valid, but at least you can see what the book looks like, and if you're interested in buying it, or have your library buy it, that'd be great. So it builds from, it's a chapter from that book I've not yet talked about in a public media reaction to Chelsea Manning. So my book largely is a critical rhetorical analysis of federal whistleblowing cases, or rather the discourses that follow major cases in whistleblowing. So I look at the history of whistleblowing protection laws, and as well major cases of whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg, like Chelsea Manning, like Edward Snowden. The impetus for the study was really the first impeachment of President Donald Trump, and how the whistleblowers in that case were anonymous, right? They weren't, or at least for most of the time in public discourse, they were not publicly known. So my question was, how did we get to this point where anonymous whistleblowers are arguably having more impact on public policy than previous whistleblowers whom we knew and whom were active in the public setting, right? Daniel Ellsberg made news regularly. We immediately knew who Edward Snowden was, who Chelsea Manning was. So how do we get to a point where we now have whistleblowers who are arguably having more impact on the political landscape in the United States than those who we did know, right? So in this broad study, I looked at major whistleblowing cases in U.S. history and really followed the puzzle pieces of news and political discourse after they occurred to see how did institutions of power, like the United States federal government, for instance, react in ways and frame their messages in ways so that it diverted attention away from actual substantive change and the reasons the whistleblowers were blowing the whistle to begin with, right? So after Edward Snowden, for instance, we talk about state security and state surveillance for a while, but really nothing changes legally. The same with Chelsea Manning. We talk about, for a moment, military malfeasance in the Middle East, but there's really no substantive change to military policy afterwards. So I wonder why. Like, how do we have these major whistleblowers, and then there's nothing really that comes from it in terms of public policy that changes, right? So I look at, that's my broad research question, is we've got these major revelations. How do they dissolve in public discourse to the point where nothing really happens in the aftermath? So I specifically look at Chelsea Manning in this particular chapter, but the broad scope is that I developed this, after looking at these patterns, I developed this theory and method of rhetorical analysis called abstruction, A-B-S-T-R-U-C-T-I-O-N, abstruction. And it's really me smashing three words together, and as rhetoricians, we were kind of creative with that type of stuff, and I was very hesitant, but the reviewers loved the idea, and it now exists, so here we are. But it's a three-part process, right, that media and institutions of power will engage in, not intentionally, but this is just how the general process plays out, is that first and foremost, when singular agents, right, so this is a theory that explains how singular agents or citizens who contest power relations, how institutions respond to them, right? So first is that they are abstracted in media discourse, right? So we'll take pieces of the individual, pieces of their identity, and they get broken apart and detached from the individual and kind of strewn about in political discourse. So with Chelsea Manning, for instance, right, so Chelsea Manning's major revelations when Chelsea was in the Army were these military malpractice, military malfeasance, most prominent of which a video that shows Reuters journalists and children being killed by the United States military, and the military effectively didn't care, right? In fact, Reuters themselves tried to get information from the United States military for a very long time and never could get it until Chelsea Manning actually released it through WikiLeaks. So the first thing that institutions of power will tend to do is abstract that agent. So Chelsea Manning, right, instead of talking about just military malfeasance and whether or not we should be engaged in these sort of atrocities in the Middle East, we talk about Chelsea Manning's upbringing, the fact that Chelsea Manning came from a broken home, the fact that Chelsea Manning is going through gender identity concerns, right? And the fact that Chelsea Manning was flipping over tables in the barracks, that Chelsea Manning was always heated in discussions when talking to her superiors in the Army. So we talk about all these other things, right, largely, instead of focusing on the sole issue, which is military malfeasance, the reason Chelsea Manning blew the whistle to begin with. The second part is ruction, which is not a very popular word, but R-U-C-T-I-O-N, which is really a quibble, a fight, a quarrel, right? We then fight about these abstractions. So there are these abstracted pieces of Chelsea Manning floating around in public discourse. We center upon them, and then we have these debates, public debates about them, right? For instance, in Chelsea Manning's case, we debated whether or not Chelsea Manning should receive feminine hygiene products while she's in prison, right? We debated whether or not Chelsea Manning should be strip searched every night. We debated Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed was happening at the same time as Chelsea Manning. Should federal funding go to gender reassignment surgeries for military personnel, right? Which are, in a lot of ways, productive and good debates. And we needed to talk about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We needed to talk about gender reassignment surgeries. And Chelsea Manning has since become a very strong advocate for the LGBTQI+ community. But Chelsea Manning's original, right, revelations were about war crimes. And so it gets, despite how good those, or how productive those discussions can be in the public forum, the military war crimes discussion gets effectively lost because we're having all these other debates that aren't exactly around the original one that Chelsea Manning revealed. And the third part of the process is that these two in concert, abstraction and ructions, then obstruct substantive democratic discourse that's seeking change, right? So the way this tends to happen then is that through these processes, the narrative gets elongated to the point where the public just simply gets exhausted on the topic, right? We've talked about Chelsea Manning for 2, 3, now 10 years at this point, right? It's as we know, the public has limited attention span, so if the topic can just get exhausted over time, change doesn't occur, right? The second is that the systems in place tend to purge these types of discussions out of the public forum, right? Chelsea Manning, for instance, was originally tried in a military tribunal. In those, there are no public cameras, there's no recording devices, no audio devices, no video devices, so everything's done kind of through layers of attorneys. That's occurring, right? And so this process, in sum, as a rhetorical construct, right, again, not intentional, but just the way it tends to play out in these patterned existences of, pattern dynamics of singular agents who are contesting power, is that they actually get detached from their name, right? So this is the rhetorical construct and how I've arrived at this abstraction is. So you and I, we have names, and there are details that if we know each other, we'll remember about each other, but I attach your name to you, right? Chelsea Manning, when you say the name Chelsea Manning out loud, instead of it being a referent to a person, it becomes a figurative venue within which we have political discourse, within which we have political debates, which then detracts from Chelsea Manning's agency as a political agent for change. And it also removes, because of all these processes, our attention, or distracts us from the actual issues that Chelsea Manning was originally revealing. And so I've theorized, and I've demonstrated in the book, that this happens most, and I focus on government whistleblowers, but if we look at cases like Colin Kaepernick, for instance, or I have a publication coming out on AOC, right, how these processes play out. Anytime there's a person who's deliberately interrogating a process or institution of power, an ideology of power, like the state, like patriarchy, like heteronormativity, right? So that Chelsea Manning is no longer the person who, right, revealed all these war crimes. Chelsea Manning is now a rhetorical construct within which we have a lot of fights about a lot of different things, and a lot of those things are good, but none of them revolve around the initial issues that she revealed. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. We as communication researchers are familiar with the contextualization of our discipline. We look at interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, dyadic, mediated, the list goes on and on. And most of this understanding is established fairly early in an undergraduate program in communication. So those terms I just mentioned, so interpersonal, intercultural, dyadic, and mediated communication. I'll limit it to those four. By show of hands, how many of you understood any of those terms when you were in high school? New Jersey offers a secondary education teacher credential titled Speech, Arts, and Dramatics. This represents our discipline as it was over 40 years ago. The Educational Testing Service, or ETS, oversees the praxis exams, which are required for all teacher certifications. The Speech Communication Content Knowledge exam includes 8 topic areas. Among these are oral interpretation / performance studies and debate. Of the 18 county colleges in New Jersey, only one of them currently offers a course in debate, and none of them offer any courses in oral interpretation. Out of the 14 public 4-year colleges and universities in New Jersey, 3 of them offer oral interpretation and 4 of them offer debate. This scarcity points out just how much our discipline has evolved, how much and how far, and clearly the topic areas on this exam don't reflect the current focus of the field of communication. Furthermore, the Speech, Arts, and Dramatics credential currently requires candidates to pass a second praxis exam in theater. Students in New Jersey colleges and universities who pursue degrees in communication studies are not required to take courses in theater history, acting styles, or stage management. So in essence, a baccalaureate degree in communication on its own does not qualify one to be certified to teach communication in New Jersey high schools. The New Jersey student learning standards are broken up into 9 content areas. Among these is English language arts, which is then delineated into anchor standards, or general expectations of what students should know by the time they complete the courses. The 4 anchor standards, which I will read in the order that they appear on the website, are reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. The fact that speaking and listening is 3rd on the list speaks volumes to me, because it illustrates an apparent disinterest in teaching these skills, as well as a lack of understanding that the Department of Education has on the discipline of communication. For the past few decades, the study of communication in teacher ed has largely been outshadowed by English. A current trend in higher education is to offer English/communications certification tracks. I've examined a few of these programs and have found that the focus is heavily placed on literature and writing. Rutgers University's Camden campus offers a master's degree in their Department of English and Communication. And among the courses they offer, they have teaching writing, teaching creative writing, teaching classics, which they have 4 different variations of, and at the bottom, teaching film and visuality. I'd like to add that that's an optional course, by the way. So the question I have for the administrators who oversee these programs, like this one, is why are there no courses in teaching oral communication or teaching media production? Certainly the pedagogical strategies for teaching competencies like interviewing skills, negotiation, public speaking, and many others are different from how teaching composition is explained. So in many cases, particularly at the bachelor's level, students in a program like this will only take 1 course in human communication, and usually it's the Gen Ed course that's offered at a 100 or 200 level. And personally, I find it hard to believe that this affords students enough training to teach communication theory interpersonal, group, and public communication, among other topics. So despite how popular communication has become as a major, the current educational structure is not preparing students to study it at the college level. That takes you back to the question I asked you at the beginning. Reading poetry out loud is not an employable skill, and neither is essay writing. And this results in students receiving poor training in oral communication and, frankly, a very narrow perception of what this field is about. So being that I'm running a little low on time, I'm going to jump ahead. What we need is an overhaul of English language arts, and one that is inclusive of oral communication. Firstly, communication needs to become a college prep subject at the high school level. Just like students take multiple science courses, biology, chemistry, physics, and they all satisfy the same requirements, communication needs to become part of the docket under language arts. Secondly, the College Board that oversees AP exams needs to develop an AP communication exam that is built on the NCAA's recommended competencies for a basic course. Thirdly, teacher certification programs need to be developed that are distinct from theater and English. All right? And finally, adequate professional development opportunities need to exist. Similar to what we have with writing across the curriculum, we need to offer similar programs for teaching communication as we see it as a discipline today. Let me conclude by making the point that today's high school students are both deserving and capable of communication courses that will prepare them for continuing education as well as for their careers. It works already. Many high school students who are in dual enrolled college programs are taking Speech 101 or public speaking courses, and they're doing just as well, if not better, than their 19 and 20-year-old classmates who are matriculated. So ultimately, we need to bridge the gap between high school speech and communication studies major that is so popular today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jacob LOCASCIO. I'm an undergrad student at Ramapo College in New Jersey. I'm a senior. And today I'll be speaking about a hypothetical health communication campaign I came up with. It's titled Boxing, Head Trauma, and Safe Boxing Practices. So basically, the goal of this campaign is twofold. It'll seek to educate both boxers, current boxers, and people who are interested in boxing, about the health risks of head trauma that are associated with the sport. It'll also try to convince these boxers and people who are interested in boxing to follow this campaign's recommended health practices to box safely. So I don't think the goal should be to ban the sport of boxing, even given the risks, or to try to dissuade people from boxing, but rather to encourage them to practice boxing safely. Because you can't really prevent people from taking the sport, but you want to encourage them to do it safely. So that's the goal of this campaign. So I did extensive studying for this. For my literature review, I covered a variety of sources. The main takeaway from my literature review is that research shows that long-term and more exposure to head trauma will result in long-term brain damage and neurological problems. So my takeaway from this is that boxers should limit the amount of fights they take throughout their career in order to avoid these long-term neurological consequences. And another takeaway from my literature review is that research shows a negative relationship between intense sparring. So sparring, like in practice, when you practice for a boxing match, you spar, and intense sparring is when you hit each other too hard. So research shows when you do that, it has negative implications for your cognition. It actually reduces your cognitive capabilities. So this relates to my second major campaign goal, which is it involves encouraging people to spar less intensely. So you want to spar safely, and you want to do it light. You don't want to spar as if you're fighting, because that results in negative cognitive implications in the long term. So for my theoretical framework of my campaign, it's based on the health theory, the social cognitive theory. And this theory basically focuses on how learning happens through social observation. So it really emphasizes role models, because when role models speak, people tend to pay attention. And this relates to the different aspects of social cognitive theory, the fundamental ones, which are attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So I want to specifically focus on attention, because the most important part of communicating to someone is you need to grab their attention, otherwise they won't listen to you. And social cognitive theory, again, emphasizes the role of role models. So since role models are so important for attention, the role models in this campaign would obviously be your professional boxer, because they're competent, right? You know they're skilled, you know they have experience, and everyone who's interested in boxing, who currently boxes, looks up to these professional boxers. So they're your obvious role model, and everyone's going to pay attention if you hear a professional boxer speak, for example. So the long-term goals of my campaign, I've already stated them, but I'll reiterate them. So the campaign will seek to encourage fighters to limit the amount of fights they take, and also to practice less intense sparring. And I have a few short-term objectives. I would like to start off with a small group of people who are interested in boxing, just to see how they react to my campaign, and if I am successful in convincing them. And also then I'll move to start doing seminars at local gyms and see how that effect goes. And if that's successful, then a network of gyms around the state. So you start off small with the small group, then you start branching out, and it gets larger and larger. So you have a sort of network of people who are following the campaign's practices. So again, my target audience are people who are interested in boxing, which means people who don't currently box yet, but who want to in the future, or boxers at any level, like amateur or professional. And also boxing trainers, because they're really influential, obviously, in the boxing world, because they not only train everyone, but they're everyone's mentor. So if you convince them of the campaign's practices, they're likely to teach their students. So I ran a needs assessment. I just surveyed a few people, and a majority of them obviously prioritize their long-term brain health. And they said they preferred a health campaign that cited scientific arguments and statistics. They liked a commercial as a health campaign format, and they also liked a boxing seminar as a format. So I split how the campaign would be implemented. I split it into two ways. One is the commercial. So commercials would be run like on YouTube or Hulu or different streaming platforms. And these commercials would be articulated by a neurologist. So there you have your authoritative health source. And it'll cover like succinctly the evidence for the campaign's recommended boxing practices and why you should follow them. It'll use graphics that show brain images, and it'll use terms such as serious neurological damage. And this does evoke a fear response, but also a rational response, because nobody wants long-term neurological damage. So they're more likely to, if they hear these terms, to follow the practices. And this specifically targets people who are interested in boxing, because those are the people that are more likely that are going to be watching like boxing videos to try to educate themselves and try to see what they're getting into. And if you watch a lot of boxing videos, then these campaigns will likely be recommended. Just that's how the YouTube formula works, so that it'll target them. The next strategy is boxing seminars, and this will target people who are currently boxing, because these will be held in local boxing gyms. So these boxers will already be there training. And going back to the role model, these seminars will be held by professional boxers. And these boxers will help them train, but at the end of the seminar, they'll teach them about the campaign's recommended boxing strategies or practices. So once again, these professional boxers will deliver these seminars very informally and personally, so it'll establish that personal connection with the boxers. And since you have that role model based on the social cognitive theory, these boxers will be more likely to listen to this professional boxer in this seminar format than say if some doctor came up and spoke. So if a professional boxer attempts to persuade them, they're more likely to listen. And that's why this section of the campaign targets boxers and why it's held using boxing seminars with professional boxers. So in the long term, I like to do further research on investigating the impact of longer rest periods between fights on reducing brain damage to see if that helps, so people won't take so many fights in such a limited time span. And also what's really relevant, like a TikTok or like a YouTube Shorts type format, to introduce these videos and the campaign's recommended practices and see if that's effective in communicating my campaign's messages. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is SHAH, and I'm a sophomore undergraduate student at the Randolph College of New Jersey. The topic of my paper is the critical analysis of the mental and physical effects of serving the military. Before I get into this topic, I want to talk a little bit about why I chose to write about this topic. Ever since I was a little kid, I was always intrigued by service members. Their uniforms, their moral, their discipline. There was just always something about the way they represented themselves that always caught my eye. I grew up spending time at the local VFW post around Vietnam War veterans, and just listening to stories that they had to tell. Every time I ran into someone from the military, whether they were active duty or retired, I always made sure I thanked them for their service. When I was 16 years old, my brother decided to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. This was not just a life-changing moment just for him, but it was a life-changing moment for me and my parents as well. My brother's the first person in our whole family to serve in the United States military. It gives me immense pride to tell my educators and friends that my brother is a Marine. We've heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, more commonly known as PTSD. PTSD can manifest in different ways, and symptoms may not always be immediately apparent. Some common symptoms of PTSD among veterans include intrusive thoughts or memories of the traumatic event, nightmares, flashbacks, and intense feeling of distress when exposed to the reminders of the trauma. Other symptoms may include avoiding places, people, or activities that remind them of the trauma, feeling numb or disconnected from others, and experiencing heightened arousal or anxiety. They may also struggle to maintain employment, experience financial instability, and have difficulty with substance abuse or addiction. PTSD can have a significant impact on a veteran's daily life, including their relationships, work, and physical health. Many veterans with PTSD experience difficulties with interpersonal relationships, including emotional detachment and difficulty trusting others. When we talk about the effects of serving the military, we often think of the individual that is enlisting and how they are going to deal with it. But what about the friends and family of that individual? I can speak from personal experience that when my brother was at boot camp for 3 months at Parris Island, South Carolina, there was not a single night that my mom had been able to get a good night's sleep. There wasn't a single day in those 3 months that my mom hadn't teared up thinking of my brother. A friend of mine currently serves in the United States Army National Guard. I met him through our local fire department, where we both currently serve as volunteer firefighters. In a few weeks, he is being deployed to Kosovo as part of the United States' efforts to defuse the tensions between Serbia and Kosovo. Now, for every single day for the next year or so, I am going to be in constant concern of my friend, wondering how safe my friend is over there, wondering what the living conditions there might be. Every time we'll get together at the firehouse, we will always be down one guy, and this is the sacrifice we have to make. We need to recognize the sacrifice of friends and family members that are making for a bigger cause. Serving the military requires an individual to have extreme mental and physical toughness. Going through boot camp and then going on deployment, domestically or internationally, can be extremely challenging for many service members. The transition from being an ordinary civilian to going door to door conducting search missions in Iraq or Afghanistan can be extremely difficult. You are constantly living on edge. Being in fear of your life every time you step foot outside your door is not something civilians like you and I are equipped for. In many instances, these veterans come home from deployment. They may be physically present with you, but mentally they are still in Iraq or Afghanistan conducting these search missions. A good example of this can be from the popular movie American Sniper, where Chris Kyle is sitting in his living room and he's got his family running around with him, but he's hearing gunshots, he's hearing helicopters, he's hearing bombs go off. He's mentally checked out completely. So many veterans have trouble transitioning from their overseas lifestyle to the civilian lifestyle because they are still stuck in that war zone they've been in for the past 4 years. This has a significant impact on an individual's mental health. If a veteran is diagnosed with PTSD, then the chances of the veteran developing physical conditions are very high. Effects such as new onset alcohol-related problems, smoking initiation, diabetes, and weight change. We need to start addressing these mental health issues because mental effects and physical effects are in direct correlation here. As of September 2022, 76% of service members in the United States military are men, yet only 1 in 10 males will seek out any sort of help regarding their mental health issues. One of the challenges in treating PTSD among veterans is overcoming the stigma around mental health. Many veterans may be hesitant to seek treatment for PTSD due to concerns about being perceived as weak or vulnerable. Men have always been held to the standard that they cannot express emotions, that the only emotions they should feel should be frustration or anger. If this is the standard for ordinary civilians like you and I, just think about what a veteran might be feeling. Someone who has endured the most physically difficult tasks and have been at the center of situations that require compartmentalizing, where their emotions need to be tucked away in a corner for the greater cause. These veterans have been in scenarios where they see their friends get killed right in front of their eyes, but they have no time to grieve. In any moment that they do show emotion, they're basically told to stop crying and train harder because this is the life they chose. In moments like these, they can't really grieve their losses. They move on without having really moved on. These are wounds we cannot see, which is why we need to look after our veterans and give them the support they need. Veterans that retire from the military often struggle with many things such as homelessness and identity crisis. For their 4-year active duty contract, they have been living one lifestyle, and that is the only lifestyle they know. Veterans account for more than 9% of all adults experiencing homelessness. That translates to 39,000 homeless veterans on any given day. Between 2009 and 2016, there was a 54% increase in the number of veterans aged 62 and older experiencing homelessness. It is gut-wrenching to think that these veterans have spent their lives making sure civilians like you and I can live peacefully in our homes, and now they find themselves without a home. This transition from military life to civilian life can be extremely difficult. More than 40% of veterans say they experience high levels of difficulty transitioning. Studies have shown that those individuals are 5 times more likely to have suicidal ideation. Suicide has become the second leading cause of death for post 9/11 veterans. That accounts for 22.3% of all deaths. It is very disturbing to know that we have went 20 consecutive years with over 6,000 veteran suicides. Veterans are at a 57% higher risk of suicide. That is more than 1.5 times the national average. We need to invest in our Department of Veterans Affairs. If the VA cannot get access to our veterans, how are we supposed to help them? We need to invest in resources to encourage veterans to speak up. The point of this paper was to emphasize the sacrifices that service members are making. It is extremely important that we recognize those sacrifices. Recognizing a veteran for their service has no dollar amount on it. It is as little as thanking them for their service. A small gesture like that can be very meaningful. Those 5 words can mean the world for that person. By you saying thank you for your service, you are building this sense of connection between you and a service member. By you saying that, you are acknowledging their service and sacrifice. Oftentimes, veterans feel isolated and misunderstood after returning from their service. This gesture can help bridge this gap and promote empathy and understanding. So I ask you all, when you leave here today and run into a service member, take the extra step. Thank them for their service. I think we owe it to them for the troubles they have put themselves through so that civilians like you and I can live a peaceful life. I thank you for your time, and God bless America.
I have a question for Dr. Professor Costa.
Julian is fine.
Okay. So I used to, 20 years ago, when I was studying for my PhD, I was working for the Center for Media Studies at Rutgers, which has since gone away because the guy who ran it died. But I remember being asked to do, and what I did, it's still on my computer, media literacy standards for the English standards for New Jersey. And I guess my question is, A, do they still exist? Because I know she went through the standards for the English, but I don't remember, I'm specifically, like I said, they're on my computer, and it was for media literacy. They were pushing media literacy at that time. And secondly, maybe that's the way to get communication into high school, maybe media literacy, not theater or something like that, but all the students are using social media now. I mean, everybody, practically, all my students, even the college kids, live on their screens. So is that, maybe that's a way in? I don't know, A, if it's still there, or B, maybe we should, if it's not there, we should put it back.
I think it still exists. I know that like with social media, for example, journalism courses will also fall under writing.
Right.
The problem is they're often treated as electives. My
Sure.
high school had a media
Sure.
literacy course, but it was an elective that they ran maybe once every year. So it's there, but in very small quantity.
It was in the English standards, and we've been fighting even to get it into college now, because, I mean, I don't know how many times I've talked to people, whenever we redo the core, which you teach in academia, that's always fun. And I'm always fighting to get media literacy to be required course, to put it in the core. But as I think one of you pointed out about, I think you did, about communication. My mother used to say to me, "You teach communication? What do you teach? Do you teach movies? What do you," and nobody seems to understand actually what I think that's still a big problem, you know? We all know what it is, but nobody seems to understand it. So I'm not surprised that it's sort of not defined in high school, since we have such a hard time defining it in college. So.
You're a discipline with many names and many descriptors.
Well, we come from different places too. Some communication departments come from.
And that convergence is wonderful, but in that case of putting a label and deciding what to prioritize, it can get stressful. I know a lot of schools will say, well, we require a public speaking course,
Right.
but that's only one small piece of it. And in the 21st century, even post-COVID, the media piece needs to be present too. So I applaud you on that.
Question for the student presenters. Mr. LOCASCIO and SHAH, is it SHAH?
SHAH, yeah.
SHAH. So you have two kind of campaign ideas. One of them, the boxing one, is a more proactive approach, it seems, and the other is a kind of a reactive approach. So I'd ask, what if you both flip the script, right? How would you communicate to boxers who are retired and experiencing head trauma? Like, what are some communication strategies that might be beneficial there? And also, if you might take a proactive approach to PTSD, what are some ways or strategies that can be employed before service people go into combat, so that the PTSD isn't as high of a rate?
Right. So I still think that role model interpersonal approach is really helpful here. So I guess in terms of people who are suffering the long-term, effects of head trauma, would be to consult those who have also suffered that but have gotten effective help, and they would be kind of the role model, or at least like a peer that you can relate to. And then you would have that person that has gotten effective treatment talk to the person who is currently going through that, and have communication there, and kind of assuage their fears, and talk to them about the process they went to. Also, it would also help to have authoritative, like, medical people also talk to them as well, so that relates to like the commercial in terms of the authoritative medical source. So I would still emphasize that interpersonal role in this, of communication, of relating to these people like face to face if you can. I think that would be helpful.
Oh, well, I want to thank you for your question, first of all. I think that's a very important point to make, how we can prevent it right before they go in. So I think the first thing I want to talk about is what boot camp is like, right? So oftentimes a lot of people that go through boot camp, they describe it as the second closest thing to hell on earth, right? Because Marine Corps boot camp is 3 months, all the other branches are 2 months, right? So I've seen Marine Corps boot camp firsthand when we went to my brother's graduation. And seeing these recruits go through the things that they go through, I think it's not surprising that they experience the problems they experience, right? So in order to prevent that, I think an important aspect would be to emphasize the practice of yoga or meditation, incorporate that anywhere in their training, right? So maybe if we extend boot camp for the rest of the branches to 3 months and solely rely just 1 month of training on just dealing with the stress that you are going to be dealing with, whether it's, like I said, yoga, meditation, or just simple breathing techniques, right? In the fire service, we're taught to have different breathing techniques to help us stay calm under stressful scenarios, and I think that is 10 times more important in the military because you are going to combat. You're in fear of your life every single day, right? And so I think the importance of just staying calm under pressure comes from the point of just knowing any meditation techniques. And it's meditation and yoga have proven to be effective in many different scenarios. So I think implementing this into the military can save our veterans even more than what the VA is doing right now.
Thank you.
Okay, you have a
Yeah,
question?
I have a question for SHAH as well. Familiar with some of the things that you covered, but certainly the homelessness statistic is staggering. And I wondered if your research has covered or you'll do further research in regards to what I guess the government could be doing to kind of help with that problem, or what is already in place for that, because it certainly, I agree with you, does feel unjust.
Yeah, of course. This is something that I'm still conducting research on about the homelessness aspect of it. But I think I've seen a lot of videos where veterans are traveling and they may get stopped by the police and they're seeing that they are just emotionally broken. They're crying and the officer is like, "Hey man, what's going on?" But the veteran is just so troubled that they really can't really express. And just recently I saw a video of a veteran holding a gun to his head, and there were cops there, they had their weapons drawn, but obviously they weren't going to shoot at him because they want to save his life rather than taking his life, right? So I think, and one of his problems was that he's homeless, he's unemployed. So as far as what the government can do, I think the government can do a lot, right? But are they doing it? Not necessarily. So I think by investing in our VA, we are making that emphasis that we are recognizing this problem and that this needs to be taken further. So by investing in our VA, we will have advocates that can take it to Congress or the Senate, and talk about it there. So I think the first step is just investing in our VA for sure.
Monetary investment in the
Yeah.
VA, yeah, and then
For
they
sure.
would advocate for mental health
Yep.
services, housing. Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any other questions?
I'm very interested. I had a student in graduate school who was an Iraqi veteran, and so I know some of what you're seeing in your brother. But as you're talking, I was thinking, my father's generation, all the men were drafted. I don't know there's many of those guys left, I mean, because it's a past generation. Not so much the baby boomers, because about half of us went, but then some didn't. But the generation before that, they all went. So did they all suffer the same thing? And if I would assume you would, because they were under fire too, then did the government do anything differently? I mean, today when you're a veteran, you're unusual, where in those days, if you weren't a veteran, you were unusual. So is there some comparison or something that was done before? Because I don't know, did they have as much PST as they do today? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think the draft was a very effective thing that happened, and I consider myself to be lucky to not be living in that era where
Sure.
I'm 20 years old. If I lived in 1945, I would have been drafted, right? So I think that's something that my generation should be very grateful for. And I think the draft was very important because, not in a positive way, because essentially it took a lot of young adults out of their homes and threw them into the trenches of Normandy, right? Or D-Day, right? And when they come back, almost all World War II veterans have struggled from some sort of post-traumatic stress, right? At that time, it may not be diagnosed because at that time there was no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. It was just more like he's kind of loopy in the head, right? So obviously at that time it wasn't really recognized, and then obviously Vietnam happened after that. So all these veterans that have went into these combat-like situations, they've always come out with some sort of post-traumatic stress, right? It doesn't have to be diagnosed. It doesn't have to be a disorder, right? Anyone can have post-traumatic stress. So I think taking the D out of that is also an aspect, because it's not so much of a disorder, right? It can happen at any time. You can be diagnosed with it at any time, and it could be any event, right? You can go through a car accident, and you can have post-traumatic stress. You don't have to be serving in Iraq to have post-traumatic stress. So to your point, like you said, it was uncommon to not be a veteran at that time. So I consider myself to be lucky that I don't have to have military service, because it's definitely not for everyone, and that's why when I see my brother, I see ever since he came back from boot camp, I see a completely different person, and my respect for him has just shot up, you know, and because I've seen the things he's been to. I mean, when he was at boot camp, I remember I was at school, and all I would do was just search up Marine Corps boot camp videos and see and watch videos of every single week of the 16-week training that they have, and I'm watching, and I'm like, man, this is what he's doing right now. So definitely has a special place in my heart.
Yeah, I mean, I think they used to call it shell shock in the old days.
that was during World War I actually.
But as you were talking about it, and I totally, like I said, I've witnessed this and everything, I started thinking, I wonder if there was cultural repercussions from the fact that an entire generation of men, especially during World War II, but even Korea's, were walking around basically with this,
Yeah.
I mean, what were the cultural repercussions of that, that maybe because everybody had it, they felt not unusual. Maybe it was easier to go back to regular life because everybody had it. And I'm wondering, and the government did provide, you could buy a house, they had the veterans and things, so there were maybe there were more things for when they came back, more landing so that they could land better in the general population.
Yeah, there was more immediate help at that time. There were really no investment in long-term help.
Right.
And to your point about the cultural repercussions, at that time, it was very common, just not as much now, but especially in that era, it was very common for the men to be, like this strong, resilient type of person who can't show that they're depressed or that, that they'll cry, because immediately when someone like that has served in, in Germany or France or whatever, and they're seeing that they're crying, then immediately that takes their manhood away from them, right? So I think now we're starting to get better at that in this generation, but there's still not enough out there about men's mental health, and I think there's so much emphasis about mental health in general, but it's often expected that females are more likely to report mental health cases than men because they don't want to be seen as weak, right? So it was very detrimental to their personality and to their mental health at that time that there were no such things. So I feel like if that were to happen now, obviously now we're in a little bit of a better situation, but I think it was a lot worse back then for sure.